Welcome to the Deep Dive, the only show that takes a mountain of specialized research and, well, extracts the most vital, insightful knowledge, delivering the intellectual summit directly to you. Today, we are undertaking a deep dive that might just fundamentally change how you understand your own mind. I mean, if you've ever wondered why you physically cringe when someone tells an embarrassing story, or why leaning forward in a chair actually makes you feel more motivated, this deep dive is for you. We are dissecting Chapter 28 of the Oxford Handbook of 4E Cognition. The chapter is written by Carr, Keever, and Winkelmann, and the focus is squarely on the embodiment of emotion and its situated nature.
Yeah, and that title, it really encapsulates a revolution in cognitive science. For decades, the dominant view was that concepts and feelings were, purely abstract information.
Like files on a computer hard drive.
Exactly. But this framework, which we call grounded cognition or embodiment theory, it asserts the opposite. It says that our higher level processes, especially emotion, are inextricably grounded in the body's machinery.
And when you say machinery, you mean?
I mean, everything, your sensory input, your motor systems, and the somatosensory feedback you're constantly getting from your body.
Our mission today is to really document the evidence for that. We want to understand how embodiment plays a causal role, not just a correlational one, in how we recognize a face, process language, and navigate our social world.
And the authors are very clear on this point. Any successful theory has to acknowledge that embodiment is situated, flexible, and dynamic.
It changes based on the context you're in.
Precisely. So we'll start by maybe refreshing the traditional frameworks that this theory challenges, then spend most of our time on the empirical evidence, which is just, it's fascinating.
And that's everything from blocking facial muscles to analyzing how physical posture affects motivation.
Right. And then finally, we'll look at the social dynamics of mirroring and what that reveals about our embodied minds.
Okay, let's start with the old guard. For listeners who follow this topic, let's quickly refresh on the core cognitive models that really dominated the field for so long. We know it was centered on nodes and symbols, but what were the philosophical pillars holding it all up?
Well, the traditional model was centered on what are called associative networks. You see this in the work of people like Anderson or Collins and Loftus from the mid to late 20th century. The idea is when you perceive something, let's say you meet a new colleague, your modal systems, like vision and hearing, take in all that raw data.
Okay.
But the key traditional assumption, and this is the immodal approach, is that this sensory input gets immediately stripped of its, its analog sensory flavor.
So it's translated.
It's translated into an abstract language-like symbol or what they call a proposition. So the visual data of your colleague becomes a node labeled, say, colleague, which is then linked to other abstract conceptual features like tall or competent.
So the actual sound of their voice or the way they move their hands, that gets left behind. It just becomes a purely mental internal symbol. And it doesn't matter how it got there.
Exactly. And this whole structure really relied on two massive and, for a long time, unchallenged philosophical assumptions. The first one is functionalism.
And that's the idea. If you think of the mind as something you could theoretically upload to a computer completely separate from the biology of the brain, that's functionalism, right?
Yes, that's it, exactly. It views all the advanced mental operations,
Yeah.
the manipulation of those abstract symbols, as being defined purely by their functional role.
The mind is software, the brain is hardware.
The mind is software, the brain is hardware. And in theory, that software could run on any physical machine as long as it performs the same functions. The specific, squishy, physical structure of your brain or your body is seen as, well, incidental to the actual thinking process. It's just interchangeable hardware.
So the container doesn't matter, only the content of the thought. What was the second major pillar?
That advanced cognition consists of operations on detached symbols. And this is really the strongest claim against embodiment.
Okay.
Traditionalists would concede that, sure, thinking about a concept like running might associate with some embodied components, maybe as a slight tension in your leg muscles.
A little flicker of movement.
Right, but they argued that these associations do not causally contribute to the pure cognitive activity of, say, categorization or inference or comprehension. They're just side effects.
Epiphenomena.
So if I categorize a cheetah as fast, the speed of that thought is purely symbolic, and any feeling of motion in my own body is basically just irrelevant noise. That's a fundamentally non-physical view of thinking.
It is. And
Yeah.
this is where the embodied perspective or grounded cognition steps in and offers what many see as a necessary correction.
And the general claim of embodied cognition seems to align perfectly with the broader 4E framework, that information processing is just inextricably shaped by the brain, the body, and its ongoing dynamic interaction with the external physical world. And we should probably clarify which specific claim this chapter is championing, because 4E cognition has, different flavors. Some of the more radical interpretations, like extended cognition, argue that the external world itself, maybe your smartphone, is literally part of your mind's physical hardware.
Right.
This chapter takes a more moderate, but I think still profound, stance. It's rooted in what's known as Barcelou's perceptual symbol system. And this view doesn't argue that your body is your concept, but rather that a thought, or any conceptual processing, involves the partial reproduction or simulation of the original sensory, motor, and experiential states.
So when I think about the smell of coffee, I'm not retrieving an abstract node labeled coffee smell.
No.
Instead, I'm partially reactivating the same neural networks in my sensory cortex that fired when I actually smelled coffee this morning. It's like a faint replay of the experience. That's the simulation.
Precisely. It's a reenactment. If you're describing a colleague, your conceptual system partially reproduces the movements they make, the sound of their voice, their signature facial expressions. And this process is functional. It's not just for color. It provides the rich analog details you need for social reasoning and deep comprehension details that abstract symbols just don't have.
It sounds almost intuitive when you put it like that.
It is. William James, over a century ago, observed that every representation of a movement awakens in some degree the actual movement.
Oh.
Embodiment theories basically take that observation and elevate these reenactments from just being incidental curiosities to being crucial causal components of understanding. The simulation is the conceptual processing itself, but it's always a partial simulation, just enough reinstatement to serve the current task. Now let's show why emotion is just the perfect testing ground for this theory. Emotion seems inherently tied to the body, a notion that goes back to the very first modern psychological theories of affect.
And that, of course, is the Jamesian classic. We see a dangerous stimulus, like the classic bear in the woods, and the common sense view is, I see the bear, I feel fear, and then I tremble and run.
James flipped that order entirely. He said the exciting stimulus, the bear, triggers an automatic widespread physiological reaction. Heart rate goes up, you start sweating, breathing gets rapid. Recognizing this altered bodily state is the emotion.
So we don't tremble because we're afraid.
We are afraid because we tremble.
That is a profound reversal of the causal arrow.
And modern theories, they really maintain this core insight, even if they add a lot more complexity. Damasio's somatic marker hypothesis, for instance, argues that while you don't always need the full-blown physical changes, you don't need a heart attack every time you feel nervous.
Right.
The brain's representation of those somatosensory and motor processes is integral to forming the emotional feeling and guiding your judgment. The body's state, or at least the internal model of that state, is the bedrock.
Okay, let's move to something really specific and observable. Recognizing someone else's emotion on their face. The emodal view sees this as just feature detection and decoding. The embodied view sees it as simulation.
Yeah, the embodied mechanism is pretty straightforward. Recognizing a scowl, for example, requires you, the perceiver, to partially engage your own frowning muscles. You create a motor reproduction, a kind of mimicry of the expression you see.
And that mimicry provides feedback.
It feeds back to your somatosensory cortex, providing an internal verification signal, a form of facial feedback that helps speed up or clarify the recognition process.
We have correlational evidence for this, right? You see a smile, you get subtle activation in your own smiling muscles. But the real key is proving causality. How do you get from correlation to proof that this simulation is necessary for recognition?
You temporarily disable the simulator. Researchers have used tasks like having participants hold a pen laterally in their mouth, which forces them to use muscles that prevent them from either fully smiling or frowning. And when that specific motor function is blocked, participants show a significant impairment in their ability to detect briefly presented or ambiguous facial expressions, specifically the ones that would normally require that muscle's action.
So the moment the mind loses access to its bodily simulator, its ability to compute the subtle emotion goes down.
Precisely. And that's really strong causal evidence. And we see this corroborated in lesion studies, too. Damage to the brain areas responsible for somatosensory and motor feedback often results in severe emotion recognition impairment.
And they've used TMS for this too, right?
Yes, using repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, or RTMS, to temporarily disrupt face representation areas also impairs the ability to recognize emotions. The picture is really consistent. The motor system is crucial.
Wait a second. If the simulation is causal and necessary, then anyone who can't frown or smile due to a permanent medical condition, they shouldn't be able to read anger or joy. But the chapter mentions patients with Mobius syndrome who have facial paralysis. Isn't that a massive hole in the theory?
That's the crucial nuance the authors address. And it's so important because it supports the idea that embodiment is a strategy, not a monolithic necessity. Morbius patients can recognize expressions.
So there are other ways.
It proves that non-embodied, more cognitive routes like decoding symbolic features still exist and can take over when the primary embodied route is unavailable.
I see.
And what's more, the reliance on simulation can vary by population. One study using TMS to inhibit face-related motor areas found that recognition accuracy was impaired only in female participants.
Really? Not in males.
In that experimental setup, males were unaffected. This suggests that in that specific context, females may have been relying more heavily on the embodied simulation strategy to understand the emotion, whereas males might have leaned on more abstract, feature-based routes.
Yeah.
So embodiment is flexible, and it's contextually employed.
So the body dictates how we read emotion. Now let's explore how it dictates how we react to it. I mean, emotion is fundamentally about motivational action, isn't it? Approach the good thing, avoid the threat.
Darwin observed this link centuries ago. He has this famous anecdote about the puff adder at the zoo. He mentally resolved not to flinch, but when the snakes struck at the glass, his body reflexively launched him backward a yard or two.
The body had already acted before the conscious thought was processed.
Exactly. That embodied reflex shows how our affective processes are organized along this physical approach avoidance dimension.
And the core finding in this area.
Established by Chen and Barg is the action congruence effect. People are faster to approach, so pull a joystick toward their body positive stimuli, and they're faster to push the joystick away negative stimuli. The emotional valence of the thing you see maps directly onto the motivational action.
But there's a debate here about how automatic this really is. If it were a pure reflex, a happy face should always make you faster to pull no matter what you're thinking about.
Right. But the research shows the link is often conceptually shaped. The effect typically only happens when the participant is asked to focus on the evaluative nature of the stimulus. For example, classifying a face by its emotion, happy versus angry. The effect is strong. But if you ask them to classify it by its gender, male versus female, the embodied motor link often just disappears.
So the mind is acting as a gatekeeper. It has to frame the task as emotional before the body's approach avoidance machinery fully kicks in.
Precisely. And there's even more evidence for this conceptual shaping. The effects happen even when the movement is purely symbolic, like bringing an object closer to your name on a screen rather than your actual body. The embodiment is integrated with the abstract concept of self.
This brings us to a finding that I think reveals the deepest interaction between the body's simple response and the mind's context, the hedonic fluency model. This study shows the body reacting even before the conceptual judgment is made.
Yes, this model, which was developed by Winkelmann and his colleagues, it posits that fast, easy processing, what they call fluency, generates a low-level, mild positive affect, which we then attribute to whatever we're looking at.
And Carr and Winkelmann designed a really elegant experiment to tease apart the physiological response from the action response.
They did. They presented participants with neutral, made-up words, pseudo-words that have no inherent meaning, like plick, and they manipulated how easy or fast the word was to read. That's the fluency.
And they used the approach avoidance joystick to make a judgment.
Right, pulling toward them or pushing away, and crucially, they manipulated the judgment itself. Half the time it was an effective judgment, is this word good or bad? And the other half it was non-effective. Is this word living or non-living?
So let's look at the movement results first. Did the fluent words trigger approach?
They did, but only selectively. The fluent, easy-to-read pseudo-words triggered significantly faster approach movements, which is consistent with fluency creating a mild positive feeling. However,
There's a however.
this effect was limited entirely to the good-bad, the effective context. In the living-non-living context, fluency had no impact on their action.
So the action itself is conceptually dependent. But what about the physiological response? What did their faces do?
That's the kicker. They measured facial EMG, the actual muscle activity for smiling, and they found increased smiling happened in response to the fluent words, regardless of the context. The low-level physiological hedonic response happened across both conditions.
Wow. So the body provides this fundamental low-level happy signal, the smile automatically. But the conceptual context acts as a mandatory filter, deciding whether that raw signal gets translated into a bigger motivational action, like pulling the joystick.
The body inputs the feeling, the mind determines the action. It's a beautiful demonstration of that interaction. And this contextual modulation is everywhere. Internal states matter hugely. For example, giving the stress hormone cortisol to highly anxious participants enhanced their avoidance movements, but specifically toward angry faces.
And we also see the opposite, right? Simple body posture can change how we process complex social information.
Absolutely. Studies comparing people sitting upright versus reclining show that when given an anger-inducing evaluation from a peer, the upright participants showed increased left frontal cortical EEG activity,
Which is a marker of.
a physiological marker of approach motivation. It's like they were preparing to confront the source of the anger. The reclining participants showed no such change. Their posture literally modulated their motivational response.
If emotion is so deeply tied to our sensory and motor systems, the grounded cognition framework suggests we should almost treat affective self as another sensory modality, like vision or touch. How on earth do you test a claim like that?
They use something called the switching cost paradigm. It's a standard method for testing how we allocate resources in the brain. The foundational finding here is that when you have to rapidly verify properties of concepts that switch between different senses, you pay a price in time.
Okay, so give me an example.
If you're asked to verify two properties in the same modality, say a fire truck is loud, auditory, and then a siren is piercing, auditory, you're fast. But if you have to switch modalities, like verifying a blender is loud, auditory, and then verifying a lemon is tart, gustatory,
You slow down.
you slow down. The system has to disengage the auditory resources and engage the gustatory ones, and that switch incurs a measurable cost.
That's a traffic jam in the brain. So the question is, does emotion cause the same kind of traffic jam?
Exactly. So researchers introduced affective features into the task. Participants had to verify features that were either sensory, like keys jingling, or affective, like triumph exhilarating.
And what did they find?
They found that switching between an affective feature and another sensory modality, say, from emotion to sound incurred significant switching costs.
So switching from thinking about an exhilarating feeling to a jingling sound slows you down just as much as switching from a sound to a taste.
That's what the data suggests. And this supports the strong grounded cognition view. Affect behaves functionally like a dedicated modality. It seems to require its own unique, embodied processing resources. For the old emodal theories, which just see affect as another abstract node in a network, this finding is incredibly difficult to explain.
Okay, let's delve deeper into how this works with something really abstract, like language comprehension. The core principle we keep coming back to is situated simulation. We don't activate every single property of a concept, just the ones that are relevant right now.
The watermelon example is perfect for this. If I just say watermelon, you think about external properties, green, striped, round.
Right.
But if I say half watermelon, you immediately simulate the internal properties, red, seeds, juicy. Your conceptual retrieval is flexible and responds to the context.
So how did they apply this to abstract emotional states?
Oosterwijk and her colleagues showed that understanding an emotion like disgust can rely on simulating either the internal experiential perspective, like reading a phrase, she felt sick with disgust, or the external action perspective, like reading, her nose wrinkled with disgust.
And I'm guessing they found switching costs between those two perspectives, even for the same emotion.
They did, which confirms that even within one concept, accessing different simulation systems, internal feeling versus external action, requires a mental shift. And they even map this onto the brain.
What do they find?
Sentences requiring an external perspective, the action-focused ones, activated the inferior frontal gyrus, which is linked to action representation and the mirror system. Sentences requiring an internal perspective, focused on feeling, activated the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is associated with representing internal affective states.
That's like a neural fingerprint for situated simulation. Different contexts recruit different physical systems to understand the same core emotion.
And we have even stronger causal evidence in language comprehension.
I'm thinking of the famous Botox study from Havas and colleagues. This creates a direct physical link between motor action and understanding meaning.
Absolutely. The researchers injected participants with Botox, which temporarily paralyzes the muscle you use for frowning. These participants were then asked to read emotional sentences.
And what happened?
When reading angry or sad sentences, sentences that would normally elicit a frown, the participants with Botox were measurably slower to comprehend them compared to neutral or happy sentences.
The physical block on the simulation system literally slowed down their ability to understand the meaning.
It did. And similarly, other studies using facial blocking techniques showed that impeding the motor system disrupted the N400 brainwave, which is a key marker for semantic processing difficulty when people read emotional words. This is so powerful because it shows the embodied response isn't just associated with comprehension, it's a causal input to the meaning-making process itself.
But let's circle back to that nuance. It's not a blind reflex, it's strategically deployed. If it were truly reflexive, then just seeing the word anger on a screen should make you frown every single time.
And Niedenthal and colleagues tested that exact point. They monitored facial muscle activation, EMG, while people looked at emotional words. And, crucially, they manipulated the task.
Yeah.
The facial activation only happened when participants were evaluating the meaning of the words, like, is this word positive or negative? When they were asked to make shallow judgments, like whether the word was capitalized, the emotion-specific facial activation just wasn't there.
So the body only simulates when the mind says, hey, focus on the meaning here.
The simulation is recruited when it's relevant. And they push this idea of strategy even further in what they call the audience experiment. Participants had to generate features for a concept like frustration. Half were told they were running for a hot audience, a close friend who wants emotional depth. The other half wrote for a cold audience, a supervisor who just wants objective facts.
And they could successfully generate features in both conditions, which already tells you that non-embodied factual routes exist.
Exactly. But the facial muscle activation associated with frustration was significantly greater only in the hot, emotional focus condition. This shows that the decision to engage this costly, resource-intensive, embodied simulation is strategic. It's dictated by the social and conceptual demands of the context.
Okay, finally in this section, let's look at how our current physical state of arousal acts as a filter on the emotional information we prioritize. This brings us back to the dynamic nature of embodiment.
Kiever and his colleagues used a paradigm called the attentional blink. This is a task where you see a rapid stream of stimuli, and you have to detect two targets. If the second target follows the first one too closely, your attention is temporarily impaired, and you often just don't see the second target. That's the blink.
Right.
So they manipulated the participants' internal physiological state. They had them either do physical exercise to increase their arousal or relaxation exercises to decrease it right before the task. Then they tested their detection of high arousal emotional words, like terror or orgasm, versus low arousal words, like distress or flower.
And the result here is one of those things that's just profoundly intuitive once you see the data.
It really is. When their bodily arousal was high, after exercise, their awareness and detection of the high arousal emotional words improved significantly. And conversely, when their bodily arousal was reduced, after relaxation, they got better at detecting the low arousal words.
So our current physical state sets a kind of resonance frequency for the emotional concepts we can even process. Congruence is key. The body doesn't just process emotion, it dictates which emotions we're capable of efficiently attending to in the first place.
And the influence of these embodied processes extends far beyond just immediate perception and language. It structures our memory and even how we understand abstract concepts like morality.
So how can a temporary motor simulation actually distort a long-term memory? Let's look at that memory distortion study.
Halberstadt and colleagues asked people to look at ambiguous facial expressions, faces that could be seen as slightly happy or maybe just neutral, and then they associated them with a clear concept label, like the word happy.
Okay.
Later, when asked to recall the face, participants consistently remembered it as being biased toward that label. They remembered it as happier than it actually was.
And how do we know embodiment was the cause?
Crucially, the amount of that memory distortion was correlated with the degree of facial EMG response that the concept label initially triggered. So the concept happy triggered a tiny motor simulation, a little smile, and that motor simulation got bound to the perceptual memory of the face. When the memory was retrieved later, that simulation acted as a physical retrieval cue, biasing the memory.
That's a powerful mechanism for how our concepts literally shape our perception of the past. So beyond memory, how does embodiment ground concepts that seem entirely abstract, like love or morality?
Through metaphor. We constantly use physical sensations, distance, temperature, to describe abstract states. Embodiment theories suggest these metaphors aren't arbitrary at all. They're grounded in our repeated physical experiences.
Let's start with distance. What did the researchers do to physically prime that idea?
Williams and Barg had subjects in a totally unrelated task, just plot points on a graph. Some plotted them close together, others far apart.
Simple enough.
But the ones who plotted points far apart subsequently rated themselves as having significantly less emotional attachment to their family and their hometown. The simple physical experience of distance literally attenuated their feelings of psychological closeness.
And temperature is maybe the most common emotional metaphor we have. A warm person, a cold shoulder.
The evidence here is just striking. Holding a warm cup of coffee versus an iced one led participants to rate a stranger as having a warmer personality, more generous, more caring. And conversely, having people recall a painful experience of social exclusion led them to literally estimate the room temperature as being significantly lower than people who recalled a positive social experience. Social rejection registers in the body as physical coldness.
And this even influences which type of metaphor we choose to use, right?
It does. And colleagues investigated this. They primed participants by putting them in physical states linked to common metaphors. So some participants were approached while they were drinking from a container, which activates the container metaphor, and others while they were searching for an item, activating the journey metaphor.
What happened?
The drinking group primed for containers. They preferred describing a person feeling high positive emotion as feeling joy, which fits the full of joy container metaphor. The searching group primed for a journey preferred describing the person as feeling happiness, as in searching for happiness. Our embodied cues are constantly nudging our conceptual preferences.
Finally, we get to this profound intersection of the physical and the moral, the idea that we can literally wash away our sins.
This is the research on embodied morality. The physical act of cleansing seems to symbolically remove the negative feeling that's associated with a moral transgression. Zhang and Liljenquist had participants write about a past moral transgression.
Okay.
They found that those who then cleaned their hands with antiseptic wipes afterwards showed reduced feelings of guilt and shame. And crucially, they were also less likely to volunteer to help someone in a follow-up task. The physical cleansing seemed to satisfy the need for moral cleansing, so it removed the motivation for a later good deed.
And this is highly specific, isn't it?
Incredibly specific. Lee and Schwartz showed that if participants were asked to type a lie on a computer, they later showed a preference for hand wipes. But if they were asked to speak a lie, they preferred mouthwash.
So the specific body part involved in the sin dictates the kind of purification you need.
It's that specific. It shows the incredible detail of this embodied conceptual link. However, the authors do caution that this area is highly complex. Research on cleansing effects has shown wildly inconsistent results. Sometimes it reduces moral severity, sometimes it enhances moral harshness, and sometimes it has no effect at all. This really highlights that the abstract moral framework we use for interpretation can often override or significantly modulate that simple physical feeling of cleanliness.
We've established that our individual cognition is embodied and situated. Now, let's pivot entirely to the interpersonal domain. If our body is our primary tool for understanding our own emotion, how does it help us understand others? And this is the function of social mirroring.
Right. Mirroring is defined simply as the replication of another person's actions, gestures, and expressions using your own motor and somatosensory resources. It's often associated with the mirror neuron system, or MNS. And the central debate here is really about the purpose of mirroring. Is it just a basic, low-level reflex from learned perception action links, a non-representational view that suggests it's just an epiphenomenon? Or is it a sophisticated, flexible processing strategy that we actively use to achieve better social understanding, affiliation, and regulation? And that's the representational view.
Okay, let's start with the evidence for it being a smart, regulated strategy, the representational view. What shows us that mirroring isn't just a blind reflex?
Well, we know mirroring is dynamically adapted to social cues. Motor imitation, for example, is heavily modulated by things like pro-social attitudes, whether we feel an affiliative drive or even if the other person's making eye contact. And facial mimicry shifts dramatically based on the social context.
For instance,
your tendency to mimic an angry expression is significantly altered by things like competition, social power dynamics, or just pre-existing negative attitudes toward that person. People in positions of power often show fundamentally different facial responses. Higher-order concepts like power and affiliation are clearly controlling the low-level physical response.
but the other side, the non-representational view, argues that mirroring is much simpler, that it's rooted in automatic associations built through learning.
Correct. That view, which is championed by researchers like Hayes, argues that mirror responses are just generated by learned perception action links built up over development. And the evidence here is that mirroring can be modified by simple training, by manipulating visual feedback, and that it even occurs when people are given strong competitive incentives not to mirror.
And people even mirror non-human things.
Most strikingly, yes. People sometimes mirror non-intentional models, like androids, and that suggests that the conceptual input about the mind of the other person isn't always required for the initial physical replication to happen.
So we have evidence for both sophisticated, concept-driven control and simple, reflexive association. How does the embodiment framework merge these two seemingly contradictory findings?
By focusing on the functionality, mimicry has been shown again and again to act as social glue. It promotes affiliation and rapport. When you're subtly mimicked, you feel more affiliation to the person mimicking you.
And embodiment explains why.
Embodiment provides the deep explanation for why that works. The idea that mimicry contributes to creating the same somatically grounded emotional state in both people.
Oh, okay.
By reproducing the other person's state in your own body, you facilitate a genuine, immediate understanding. You create a shared emotional connection. And that's what fosters trust and rapport. The physical simulation is the mechanism for the social effect.
And just like with our individual embodiment, this social function is subject to intense contextual moderation based on concepts like social identity.
Absolutely. The effect of mimicry is highly contingent on group membership. Studies show that being mimicked by an in-group member makes you feel socially and physically warmer. It boosts affiliation. But being mimicked by an out-group member actually makes you feel colder.
It can trigger defensiveness.
Right. And if you have negative attitudes toward the person, you might even engage in what's called counter-mimicry, where you actively reverse the typical motor response.
So the body is constantly acting as a social compass, guided by these complex conceptual labels like in-group or competitor.
And this embodied interaction, it extends beyond just the two people involved. It influences how third-party observers judge the entire social interaction. Generally, observers infer positive affiliation just from seeing mimicry happen.
But that judgment can become more complex if the mimicry is seen as inappropriate.
Yes. In one fascinating study, observers watched a person interact with a model who was intentionally acting rude. Now, if the target person went on to mimic the rude model,
What happened?
third-party observers judged the mimic as incompetent.
And here's the astonishing part, right? This judgment of incompetence happened even when the observers failed to consciously notice that the mimicry was even happening.
Exactly. It suggests that the non-selective or, injudicious use of embodied responses, mimicking someone regardless of their social rudeness, is automatically interpreted by others as a marker of social incompetence. The utility and flexibility of our embodied responses are constantly being evaluated by the social world, often completely below the threshold of our consciousness. So we've covered a massive territory today, but the summary is pretty clear. The conceptual processing of emotion is fundamentally embodied. It's not some abstract software routine. Instead, it involves the partial reuse and reinstatement of our sensory, motor, and experiential states from our real-world interactions.
And these embodied resources, our facial muscles, our approach and avoidance tendencies, our current level of arousal, they're all causally vital inputs to understanding emotion and even abstract concepts like morality. But crucially, the system is designed for efficiency and flexibility. We strategically deploy these embodied simulations based on the context, the task, and our immediate physiological state.
I think the ultimate takeaway is that while the embodiment perspective has fundamentally shifted cognitive science by highlighting the causal role of the body, a satisfactory, mature theory has to account for the dynamic interaction of these low-level modal bodily processes with our flexible, high-level, context-sensitive conceptual processes.
So the embodied responses are powerful.
They're powerful inputs,
Yeah.
but they were filtered, they're gated, and they are modulated by the meaning that we assign to the situation.
So what does this all mean for you? Well, next time you are processing a difficult conversation or reading a complex article, try to pay attention to the subtle physical cues in your own body, a slight tension, a change in your posture, and unconscious facial movement. The fluidity and context dependency of our embodied responses suggest that we are constantly using the meaning of our body's actions, not just the actions themselves, to navigate a complex social world. Your simple physical movements are serving a crucial emotional and social function, influencing your own understanding and the judgment of others, often before you are even consciously aware of it. That is something to chew on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.